talking about today is kind of builds on some of the primary areas of research that we've worked on for a number of years. And I'm delighted to have a chance to present with Sanne, who will take the lead with presenting on one of the new studies, and I'll present on the second. So broadly, we'll be talking about research on factors that shape development, focused on identifying factors that shape development and experience in autistic children, as well as a broad line of research that focuses on identifying the earliest features of autism to ensure that kids receive the appropriate supports, and families are receiving supports from as early as possible. In terms of factors shaping development and experience and knowing the diversity of those experiences among autistic children, we'll talk about what we've learned through a long-standing program of research called the Pathways in Autism Study, as well as a new study, which Sanne will speak about, the Pediatric Autism Research Cohort. Similarly, in terms of research focused on early features of autism, we'll talk about insights from our ongoing research program focused on younger siblings of autistic children, as well as a new research program, which is referred to as the Next Gen SIB study, which actually focuses on nieces and nephews. So kind of expanding the family tree, working with infants whose parent actually has a sibling who's autistic. So to give a bit of a brief overview of the Pathways study, this has been ongoing for about 20 years. The focus is on children sort of around the time that they've been diagnosed through the clinic, under the age of 5. So working with a group of preschoolers with a new diagnosis. There are a total of over 400 children and families that we've been really fortunate across multiple sites in Canada to have a chance to kind of join them in their journey from that initial diagnosis now into transition into early adulthood. And our team is actually looking at currently sort of how to engage with those adults to sort of better understand what their priorities are in research moving forward. The 5 sites are all the way from Vancouver to Halifax. They kind of share a common focus on being at kind of university centers, which, as Sanne will mention, is a bit of a contrast to the new Park study. It's a study that involves families, but also involves schools as well as the youth themselves. We sort of draw on information from multiple sources, with kind of a breadth of areas of focus, including autistic features, cognitive development, daily functioning, as well as aspects of mental health. And because it's a longitudinal study, the focus really is on how kids are doing over time. The general statistical approach within the study is to try to look at, among that large group of kids, sort of what the diversity is, not just at a single point in time, but rather over time, and among the group, kind of using a statistical method called semi-parametric group-based modeling to see whether there are subgroups that are relatively similar to one another. And because it's longitudinal data, we can look at whether there are these subgroups based not only on how they present at a given point in time, but rather sort of what their experience is over time. So this is a couple examples of the types of analyses that have been reported for this group. The first is looking at changes in autistic features. Based on the analysis, there sort of appear to be sort of 2 groups sort of among the larger group, one that start with a higher level of autistic features and one that start with a somewhat lower level. And it's interesting to see that there's a somewhat qualitatively different pattern over time, whereas the autistic kids that start with a higher level of autistic symptoms, that high level tends to be sort of tends to persist to a greater extent than the kids who start with a lower level. One of the key observations, though, in the study is that development experience is not uniform across these different areas. So, I mean, autistic features are the kinds of things we observe, say, during the ADOS, but maybe more important in terms of day-to-day is sort of what kids are actually doing functionally, which perhaps is better measured using the Vineland scales. So less about social differences and more about social abilities. And in that analysis, it's interesting that the subgroups don't neatly map onto the subgroups that were identified through the ADOS, but rather there's greater diversity and to some extent perhaps greater stability and even growth kind of more uniformly over time. Although, again, there's a subgroup that start with sort of less advanced functioning that don't make the same gains relative to their peers, and there seems to still be this inclining down. So understanding sort of how to support kids across the spectrum, particularly those that may have greater needs, I think is one of the issues that's sort of really sort of brought into focus based on this research. Um, as I mentioned, another focus is mental health, and it's interesting to see, looking at the data over time, that there's actually sort of greater diversity, and there isn't this sort of simple uniform pattern of gradually increasing or gradually decreasing, but rather you have these two middle groups that are actually kind of going in opposite directions. And so it is interesting that the crossing point is not far from when the kids enter school, so that you've got this group of children with moderate levels of anxiety when they're first diagnosed. Some of them become more anxious as they enter school, and some become less. So understanding sort of the differences and how to best support those different groups of kids, I think, is an important impetus for us as clinicians. And it really emphasizes that it's not a one size fits all approach, either in terms of how we support kids or even sort of how we talk to families about what they can anticipate about the future. I'm just going to check in with Lori and Sanne. Is my sound okay, or am I okay? Good. And then I think another really important aspect of pathways is just getting to know kids and families over time and having a chance to invite parents to talk about their kids. And one of the specific studies was using kind of like an open-ended part of one of the parent questionnaires that actually kind of reports on mental health, but it also gives parents a chance to talk about the best things in their kids. Um, so it really sort of emphasizes the importance of a positive framing, and appreciating people as individuals and not only focusing on a diagnosis. So here are the top six kind of things that parents love about their kids. That they're loving, that they're happy and kind, intelligent and friendly. And it's important to note that when parents of non-autistic kids are asked a similar question about what they love about their kids, what are the best things, they actually come up with relatively similar answers. And it really speaks to both the diversity among kids, but the fact that there's some elements that are universal, and that the strengths among autistic kids, in many ways are like the strengths among kids generally. And just sort of recognizing the individual, recognizing the strengths of the individual, and not only focusing on their support needs. So we've learned a lot through pathways, but we realize that there's a lot more to learn. I think the one of the insights of pathways is recognizing that things change over time, and kids face a lot of exciting changes and challenges sort of as they transition through different stages into school, kind of into middle school, as they're sort of facing kind of greater social demands, that there are a lot of things going on in their life outside of school as well, recreational activities, family life and community life. And we also recognize some of the limitations of pathways, including the fact that most of the participants do come from families that are making their way to academic centers. There's, honestly, the diversity of the pathways participants don't really fully represent the diversity of Canadians, and maybe in part because our kids are coming through the academic centers. The other thing is that the participation rate among newly diagnosed kids was about 50 to 60%. And there's an interest in understanding sort of that other 40 to 50% as well. Can we come up with a research strategy that is more inclusive, and remove barriers to participation? So one of the feature of pathways is families need to actually come into the center, every year or two, and early in the study, sort of even more frequently. So that can also present barriers. So with that in mind, our colleague Stelios Georgiadis, along with the team, developed this concept of a new longitudinal study that could be more inclusive and diverse, and taking a measurement approach that was more flexible for families, that might allow greater participation and maybe even larger numbers. So I'll turn it over to Sanne to talk a bit more about that.
Thanks, Lonnie. And you might hear me shouting slide every once in a while, as Lonnie's in control of the slide deck this morning. So with that in mind, McMaster Hospital and Stelios Georgiades, along with Lonnie and a few other co-investigators, developed the Pediatric Autism Research Cohort. I am going to take you through just really the nuts and bolts of what Park is looking at, what they're investigating, and also just practically how they're doing this, who they're looking for, and where it's available. So, just to get us started, the park is another longitudinal study in the same way that the pathways study was that Lonnie just spoke to. And it is recruiting children who are newly diagnosed with autism. So how we sort of operationalize that is children who have been diagnosed within the last 12 months with autism. We are collecting information on children's functioning and abilities and factors that we think might be influencing those trajectories that we were speaking about a little bit earlier. The main difference here between the pathway study is that they are a little bit more focused, and the information is coming from parent report, again, as Lonnie mentioned, just to remove some of those barriers of coming into the center. It also allows us to offer this opportunity to engage in research to a much wider spectrum of families as well. And then the purpose is really just to understand those factors or examine the factors that influence diversity and unfolds over time as a longitudinal study. So we're really looking at some of these factors on the right-hand side, those factors influencing development, from sort of a child level to a family level and then to an environmental level as well. So we're looking at factors such as socioeconomic status, family experiences, child strengths as well, also some symptoms and behavior. And we're really also looking at those services and supports that families are engaging and using at each and every time point, and the availability of resources in their particular area or things that they have access to. So we're really trying to look not just at functioning and ability of the child themselves, but we're also looking at this from a family level and from an environmental level that supports them. Next slide, please. Great. So again, the study goals are really to generate some new knowledge about these factors that are contributing to the diversity that Lonnie spoke to, and that we sort of uncovered in following all of these families using the pathway study. But really, we're looking specifically for those preschool and early school years. So we're looking for that time point from sort of time of diagnosis to that entry to school age around there. And then how maybe the characteristics of the services and interventions that the family and the child are receiving are associated with that diversity that we see in some of those graphs and trajectories as well, and how that impacts not only child but family functioning as well over time. And then the last goal here is really to help generate further research evidence so that we can really start to bridge that gap of communication between clinicians and families as they work to develop sort of more personalized and individualized care and intervention plans for autistic children. So who is able to take part in PARC? I think, as I alluded to, children with a new diagnosis within the last 12 months, and that the child is under age 7. In comparison to many of our other longitudinal studies, and many of the other studies that we've conducted at the research center, there are really very few inclusion and exclusion criteria for this study. Again, just to sort of remove some of those barriers from families who would otherwise maybe not be able to participate in research for one reason or another. So we really wanted to make this as inclusive as possible, sort of remove all of those barriers to entry. So as long as the child is diagnosed within the last 12 months and that they're under age 7, we would sort of welcome their family into the PARC study. In terms of what's involved, we are seeing, well, not seeing families, but we're asking families to be involved sort of twice a year to fill out a set of online questionnaires until the child turns 8. So, just to give you an idea, currently the children who have enrolled in Park are sort of between the ages of 2 and 4. They can be up to age 7. So they would be enrolled and be asked to fill out these questionnaires every 6 months until their child turns 8 years old. But if a child enters, of course, at age 7, then they would be sort of seen for fewer time points. They have a 3-month window to complete each set of questionnaires. The questionnaires are about 1 to 3 hours each time. The 3 hours is really for those initial visits where we ask some more demographic information and consent those families into the study. But typically 1 to 2 hours would be about the timeline that it would take to fill out the questionnaires. And we do offer sort of $20 thank you gift cards at the end of each time point where families are filling those questionnaires out. We are asking about a variety. Lonnie, do you mind clicking just one more time there? I think there's a, oh, never mind. Sorry, go back. There we go. Okay. These are new animations to me, so I'm just getting used to them. So what kinds of things are we asking about? I sort of alluded to the subject matter, but we're specifically using this list of questionnaires below. So we're looking at things like demographics. We are looking at family life, symptoms, service use. So really, as I mentioned before, looking at some child level questionnaires, things like the behavioral and flexibility scale, and the sensory experiences questionnaire and the Vineland adaptive behavior scales. But we're also really interested in some of those family factors and environmental factors that are at play there at each time point. So a lot of these other questionnaires are sort of asking about sort of those broader support networks in terms of family and resource availability as well. And just a note as well that the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, it's the parent report. So we are not actually contacting those families. They're filling it out online along with all of those other questionnaires. Thanks, Lonnie. We do use an online study platform. It is a really user-friendly platform. I was actually really surprised. I've used a few of these online platforms, and this one seems to be really user-friendly. Families get their own hub that they can log into where they can access their questionnaires, access all of their study information at any time. And then they get sort of notified by email if there are new questionnaires that are in the Family Hub ready for them to fill out. It's sort of a standardized online data collection platform that all of the sites are using, where we can sort of start to pool that data. Each team has their own portal for their own site, and then families have their Family Hub that they can use as well. One sort of unique part about the Park study is that families actually do receive a summary report at the end of each of the time points. So just to be really clear, this summary report is based on the answers that they provided in the questionnaires that were given to them, but it's a nice tool to have because we are providing this every 6 months, so they can sort of compare and contrast those reports. They are also available in the Family Hub for them, and if it is of interest to people who are involved in their clinical care or at school with their child, they can very easily print those reports off, those summary reports, and provide those to people who are involved in their child's care as well. well. Maybe, enhancing communication between and bridging those gaps between school and clinicians and the families. And I think the hope ultimately is with the information that is generated through the park study that we can actually start to use some of this information at different sites to help with the clinical decision-making process for some of these kids and sort of have more of an individualized approach. So this is again just a summary of what's involved, a little timeline. So entry into the park study, families have 3 months to complete the questionnaires each time they're asked. To complete questionnaires every 6 months, they receive a research summary each time point until study exit at age 8 at this point. So really just looking at that preschool to entry to school sort of timeline for the time being. So Lonnie had also alluded to this, that Pathways really used universities as the foundation for where our sites were for the Pathways study. It is definitely varied with the park study, and it's really interesting to see where our study sites have sort of popped up across the country, and also we have an international site now as well. So as you see, we've got 7 sites, 6 of them within Canada, and then 1 in Israel at the moment. We have 2 research centers that are represented. So Israel is the Autism Center at Hebrew University. We're located in the Autism Research Centre, but again, within sort of a clinical care facility as well. So not sort of positioned within the university lab or recruiting from the university lab. And then we've also got in Hamilton, Ontario, McMaster Children's Hospital, Kingston. Our site is at Kids Inclusive, which is it's a center for child and youth. They offer a lot of intervention programs, a lot of early intervention programs as well. In Ottawa, it's the Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, and they also take on a lot of their, intervention programs and assessment clinics as well. Sudbury, Ontario, it's actually the Child and Community Resources Center, so specialized services kind of that is active in recruiting participants, so really embedded in their clinical services in Sudbury as well as in Manitoba through the Child Development Clinic. So we've got sort of this wide variety of research sites that's really going to allow us not only to look at these factors within sort of our own environment or one kind of environment, but really allow us to maybe hone in on some of that diversity that we were seeing in the pathway study and understand it a little bit better. Our projected recruitment is over 1,000 children across all sites. I think this would make this one of the largest cohort projects of its kind. So we are really hoping to sort of meet those targets. Again, of course, that's across all sites, not one site. But again, reducing those barriers to entry, we're really hoping to engage as many families as possible. Oh, there we go. Yeah. And just a quick thank you to all of the participating sites and the supporters of the park study. You might see this QR code pop up. It's already popped up once in the presentation. We have sort of moved to a QR code format for some of our recruitment as well. So if you're interested in hearing more about any of the studies that we're sort of presenting on today, please feel free to use the QR code. We can always send it out after if you need to. So that's at the bottom left corner, and it'll pop up again before the end of the presentation. And I
Great.
will,
Thanks very
yeah, okay.
Thanks very sorry to jump in. Thanks very much, Sanne. And one of the things I really enjoy about these research rounds is I think because we've gone online, if I look at the group of participants today, I can see that you're representing areas all over the province. And one of the nice things about the park study is because all of the information is gathered online, it doesn't actually need to be restricted to the Edmonton area. So certainly, if you think that there are families in your community that might be interested in participating, we'd be glad to hear from them. Whether that's in Edmonton or St. Albert or Fort McMurray, there's definitely a flexible approach to support that kind of participation.
Participants so
Okay, so
far are
shifting.
spanning, sorry, Lonnie, I was just going
Oh,
to
go
say
ahead, Sanne.
our participants so far are actually quite spread out across the province, which is really interesting. And one of the comments that was made from, the families who were entering the study was that they weren't actually sure if we would want them to be in the study because they weren't from one of the major hubs, and they weren't often asked to be sort of representing the services and sort of what the system looks like in their area. So it was actually really important for those families in sort of more rural areas or areas away from city centers. It was important to them to sort of have their voices heard within the context of the park study as well.
Excellent. Okay, thanks so much, Sana. Okay, so we'll shift to talking about research focused on early features of autism. Certainly shares a lot in common with the research that we've been talking about up till now in terms of it taking more of a developmental view, sort of how kids are learning and developing over time. And I think that also thinking about how to approach research in a way that it captures diversity across the spectrum. Um, so this is work that it's incredible. Our study team got together this summer and we realized that it was kind of our silver anniversary that we'd been working on this for the past 25 years. So this is really working with infants who have an older autistic sibling. And kind of in some ways similar to the pathway study of the group of kids that we've been following have now been followed from infancy now in some cases up to older adolescence and sort of those transition years to adulthood. I think the idea is knowing that there's a higher rate of autism when there is an autistic sibling. It's a chance to work with a group that does have a certain probability of developing autism and being able to join parents for their journey and map the early signs along the way. The other important aspect of it is that we don't have to wait for kids to be identified or referred from the community. So it does give us a chance to see young children who, because their features are subtle or because they have less significant language or intellectual delay. I mean, those are often kids that we don't end up seeing until well in the school age years. So it is a really unique opportunity to see what that group of kids is like in early childhood as well. And this is genuinely a group that's at higher rates. So the R group, as well as a number of groups that follow younger siblings over time, kind of revisited sort of what the rate of autism is by the time those siblings hit the age of 3, and it's roughly 20% or 1 in 5. The graph here shows that it's not surprisingly a bit higher if there's already 2 autistic siblings rather than 1. I think another interesting takeaway is that the rate of autistic boys to autistic girls is roughly 2 to 1. When the same research consortium looked at their data about 15 years ago, it was more like 3 to 1. So even though the rates on the whole are not dramatically increasing, I think within the study approach, we're starting to get a bit better at picking up autistic girls at an early age and recognizing that particularly early in development, there's a lot of there's more similarities than differences, and it does sort of raise interesting questions about why that group of girls is not being identified in clinical practice to the same extent, because I think clinically the ratio of boys to girls is still closer to 3 or 4 to 1. Our Canadian study has involved kind of colleagues and participants from Halifax, Toronto, and Hamilton. Over time, we've worked with about 500 families where there's an autistic sibling, and we've had the pleasure of following the younger infant, and then about 180 families where there isn't a family history of autism, but the families have still kind of been generous with their time and allowed us to get to know their infant over time to provide a bit of a reference point for what we expect in development when on the same measures when there isn't a family history. Um, some of the specific measures we'll talk about today are measures of early autistic features, of general development, and we also have looked at sort of temperament, emotional regulation, mental health, and that part of the study design is to spend time with the kids starting at 6 months and at regular 6 month intervals until they hit the age of 2, and then to be doing some standardized diagnostic assessments. That clinically we've provided a diagnosis at any point that we felt the kids have met the criteria. We've looked at our data sort of based on kids who've met criteria at 18 months, 2 years, and 3 years. And the unique feature of the 3 year assessment is a clinician is seeing the kids who haven't met the family before, haven't reviewed the files, and are giving kind of an independent assessment of diagnosis so that it's independent of those early measures. Um, I think many of you have heard us talk about our interactive observational scale. Includes a number of early features of autism, largely drawing on the expertise of parents as well as some other early measures, sort of from an era prior to longitudinal studies of infants. It's been really gratifying for us because it's been adopted by a number of other study groups. They've actually found very similar findings as our group has. So it's nice to see that researchers who haven't actually been involved in developing the scale are finding similar things. The other nice thing is because an aspect of it is that we try our best to code what we're seeing sort of in real time. Another group has actually looked at the agreement between clinical impression based kind of in real time versus going back and doing kind of detailed review of the videos, and the agreement is actually quite good. The other nice thing about that is that the review of the video is without knowledge of whether the child has an older autistic sibling. We often know that sort of in the early stages. So it's good to know that when we're seeing features, it's not simply because we're aware that there's an older autistic sibling. Um, this is kind of the bottom line in terms of sort of how we see autistic features developing over time. These three groups, the IL stands for increased likelihood. So among the younger siblings, there's a group who develop autism. So that's depicted in green. There's a group that don't have a diagnosis of autism at age of 3, so they're depicted in red. And then there's the infants who don't have an autistic sibling that are depicted in blue. It's interesting that there are differences observed in the sibling group as a whole compared to the infants who don't have a family history of autism. But at least based on what we observe in the clinic, we see differences among the sibling group based on whether or not they develop autism that are emerging by 12 months. And these are some of the features. This is our great colleague, Jessica Bryan, who's been both involved in a sibling study and has also led a research program providing specific supports and interventions for infants sort of showing early signs. These are some of the differences that we see at 12 months that are more common among the group of infants who end up diagnosed with autism. They broadly cover the range of diagnostic features that we think about from diagnosis of older kids, including social communication differences, kind of preferences for particular objects, some sensory differences, and sort of more general attention differences as well. Um, as part of this research program, we developed a parent report questionnaire version of this observational schedule. Lori has led analyses of this work, and it's interesting that provided, when we're looking at similar aspects of development and communication, parents actually identify differences even earlier than we detect them on an observational measure. So for instance, the degree to which that the kids are vocalizing back and forth is something that parents are identifying at 6 months, whereas it sort of flies under our radar at that early stage. And you can see by 9 months, parents are more often reporting differences in these areas in the infants who go on to an autism diagnosis versus those that don't. And from an open-ended perspective, if you just have a conversation with parents, and again, this is work that Lori has led, the parents are incredibly astute to the subtle differences in their kids' development. And again, sort of like in real time, sort of without knowing whether their kids will end up being diagnosed with autism, parents of the younger siblings who end up also having an autism diagnosis more frequently report sensory differences and motor differences, interestingly, compared to the non-autistic siblings, as well as the infants who don't have a family history. It's important to emphasize, sort of in the spirit of the diversity that we talked about related to the Pathways and Park study, that sure, if we look at autistic kids as a group, they do have differences compared to the non-autistic kids. However, there's a lot of diversity even among the autistic kids. If we look at all of the siblings and sort of the pattern of changes in those AOC scales, so the number of autistic features that we see over time from 6 to 18 months. I mean, broadly, there are three groups that differ in terms of kind of how many of the features and how those features change over time. And the truth is the autistic kids are roughly evenly distributed among those groups. So among infants that have lots of features that increase over time, it's very likely they'll have autism. But in fact, that's just a minority of all the kids with autism. And it really speaks to the fact that we can't be complacent or oversimplify the differences. And again, this can't be a one size fits all approach to how we monitor and support families. And we need to recognize that no matter how much time we spend with families and how kind of engaged clinicians and families are, that sometimes the subtle differences will emerge later, and we need to have a more continuous process of monitoring and support. So that takes us to this new project, the Next Gen SIBS project, supported largely through the Autism Science Foundation. Um, so it's interesting that the idea for this project largely came out of the sibling study. So as I mentioned, these sibling studies have been ongoing for the past 20 or 25 years. So the infants who participated are now adults and actually starting to start their own families. So those adults who have an autistic sibling are now wondering sort of whether their infants need closer monitoring. And some colleagues, we weren't directly involved in the stage, kind of invited those parents to have a focus group. So really those siblings grown up who are now contemplating having their own kids. And some of the insights from those conversations were that those siblings really bring kind of pretty unique lived experience sort of in growing up with an autistic sibling, which probably does shape sort of both how they observe for early features and their ability to detect subtleties and how they would talk about it in a clinical discussion. Um, Moving from siblings to nieces and nephews may give us a different view of the diversity of early features and maybe bridge from this study that's only focused on siblings to the broader community. And I also think that there was a sense that, these families that have participated in sibling research over the years are now turning to, in some respects, the same clinical research groups for support. And it is an opportunity to give back, to be able to provide some monitoring for their kids as well, while at the same time learning more about the diversity of early development in autism in a way that may inform monitoring and surveillance in the broader community. Um, we're in kind of the first year of this research program, which is kind of a pilot or discovery year. Broadly, we're trying to see kind of what those clinical features might be among these young infants who have an autistic uncle or aunt, and also trying to get a better sense of how parents would like to talk about their observations and the kind of language that they would use. Um, this is a study that involves our group as well as five groups in the US, in part because we had an important role in developing the study. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the assessments that are being used for these nieces and nephews compared to what we've used in our SIB study over the years, including that observational scale, the AOC, the parent questionnaire version, the same sort of parent concerns interview, and then some of the general measures, including of general development. Um, it's been interesting starting out because although in theory there might actually be more infants that have an autistic aunt or uncle than have an autistic sibling, those families aren't necessarily connected to the clinic or to sort of other sort of autism activities. And the truth is the parents that we're interacting with, it's on the basis of them having an autistic brother or sister who may live in a different community. There may be sort of varying degrees of sort of how to what degree they're sort of in close contact or sort of have a comfort in kind of talking about these kinds of issues. So we're still kind of learning how to get the word out that we're interested in working with this group of families. As a pilot study, the numbers they're certainly not going to be 500 like with our SIB study. So even though we're interested in whether there are some genuine differences in early features, we're probably won't be there sort of in the early stages of the study. I think sort of one general issue that we've grappled with through the SIB study and now thinking about it in this study is just the whole process of informed consent and just being how we sort of articulate that boundary between research and clinical service. Like on one hand, wanting to give back to these families, but on the other hand, ensuring that we're providing kind of clarity and transparency in terms of what we're offering and where there's a need to kind of for more clinical supports to be able to make sure that we're facilitating that rather than assuming that it's all embedded within the research. But ultimately, by learning about the development of these younger kids and sort of drawing on the insights of these parents who now have this unique dual perspective of monitoring their younger kids, but also kind of being so knowledgeable about autism, having grown up with an autistic sibling, really does have the potential to inform care for the broader community. Overall summary, two new studies, one focused on early features in nieces and nephews, and the second study focused on what shapes development in newly diagnosed autistic preschoolers. And again, as the shout out to Sanne and the QR code. And we're hoping this QR code may make it a little easier for families to simply kind of find out information about the study and contact us directly. Of course, we're grateful for any support in people who are working clinically in the school system and the service system who can also help us get the word out about these studies. So bottom line, it's important to learn about factors shaping development and experience among autistic kids. Of course, we'd like to move from simply describing kind of what shapes it to actually making a difference. I think one way that we're hoping to do that is within PARC compared to pathways, there's probably even a stronger focus on supports and services and trying to understand kind of what's really making a difference um, and the and by putting a greater emphasis on feeding the information back to clinicians, we're hoping that the research data could potentially provide sort of kind of enhanced information to guide service planning. And likewise, the importance of learning more about the early signs of autism and not just in siblings, and making sure that we're attending to the greater diversity, both in terms of clinical complexity and just the general diversity in the community. So that covers the content of the presentation. Just a kind of some heartfelt acknowledgments to our Autism Research Center team. Huge thanks to Sanne for her leadership in this work and to Lori as well, to our extended team, some of whom are depicted in the photo and listed on the slide. Also acknowledgement to the leadership of the McMaster team on both the PARC and Pathway study, to our wonderful colleagues in the SIB study, as well as the Next Generation Project, to the Stollery Children's Hospital Foundation, who supports many of the activities of the Autism Research Center, as well as my personal research role, and of course, the amazing children and families who've participated in the research, and to our community colleagues who have also supported this work over the years. So thank you.